All right, hi everybody. Gonna give it a couple more seconds because I see people are still coming on. Sometimes it takes a minute or two. All right, so let's talk about textiles. So welcome everyone. So glad that you could join us today. We're going to do a little textile 101 today. So this is 101. So this is the basics. So for some of you, all of this information might be new. Some of it might be new. Some of it might just be a refresher. But hopefully there's a little bit of something for everyone who's logged in. I just wanted to take a quick second to introduce myself and kind of introduce you to Zoom. So my name is Karen DePau, and I am the manager of local history services at the Indiana Historical Society. And I primarily do the work that deals with the collections. So work with organizations across the state dealing with things like writing collections management policies, talking about best preservation for their collections in general, not just textiles. Textiles are my specialty, but I am a collections generalist. So I do everything that kind of deals with the collection. For those of you, I know there were quite a few on the list that aren't necessarily from Indiana and might not necessarily be familiar with the local history services department at the Indiana Historical Society. So I did want to do just a really brief introduction to you all about kind of who we are in general and what we do. Our local history services department is what's known as a field services department. So what we do is there are 4 of us in the department and we do work out in the state. So instead of, I don't work directly with the collections at the Indiana Historical Society. Instead, I work with and assist folks who work with collections all across the state at local, usually primarily volunteer-run organizations. So we go in, we also have Bryce Gorman, who's our fundraising educator, who helps folks with fundraising. We have Jeanette Rooney, who does a lot of our audience engagement, including exhibition design and social media and marketing. And then we have Tamara Hemmerlein, who is going to introduce herself here in a second. So she will tell you a little bit more about what she does. Really briefly, though, I also wanted to not forget to mention that a lot of different states around the country have field services offices of some kind. Some are like us and live under the umbrella of their state historical society. Others are completely individual organizations. Some are government agencies in your state. But I did want to let you know, if you're not in Indiana, that you can head over to the American Association for State and Local History and look up their Field Services Committee. And on that page, you will find a listing of every field services officer in the United States. So you can look up your own state and kind of find who's listed there and reach out to them. And they will offer some things that are similar to what we do and probably some things that are completely different because we all do things a little bit differently. But that is a resource that's available to you. So I'm gonna let Tamara introduce herself really quickly because you're gonna see her a smidge today as well.
Hi, as Karen said, I'm Tamara Hemmerlein. I'm the Director of Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society. And I handle a lot of the consultations and site visits and trainings that deal with governance, administration, planning of all types. I tell everybody I get to do the really cool and interesting kind of training. And I do also want to acknowledge Lilly Endowment, Inc. for their support of our distance learning programs, and this webinar is part of that. I'll be here today second chairing Karen. If you have any technological issues, just go ahead and put them in the chat box and I'll do what I can to solve them. I'll also be kind of looking at the chat box and monitoring questions and things like that as we go along. So welcome everybody, and I'll turn it back over to Karen.
All right, thanks, Tamara. So since she mentioned the chat box, I wanted to point out to you, if any of you are still after 6 months and new to the Zoom platform for things like webinars or meetings, you'll notice at either the bottom or the top of your screen, kind of depending on how yours is set up, a black bar that has, on the far left side, you will see a small microphone. That should have a red line through it because all of the participants are muted in the webinar format. You will also see a line through the video camera, which means that we can't see any of you. We do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, so just kind of be aware of that. If that's a problem for you, you can hop off and send us your questions, and you can get the recording if you'd rather not be recorded. But primarily what we'll be using today for any questions that you have is either the Q&A option, which is up in that black bar, or the chat function. So the chat function allows you to send those questions to either Tamara or I individually or to the entire group. So it can be great if you have a question that you're kind of wanting to crowdsource an answer to, if you're looking for other people's possible solutions that they have done for something. And excuse me, but both the question and answer and the chat function is what Tamara will be monitoring for questions throughout. So she will pepper me with questions throughout if it seems like it's something that makes the most sense to ask right then. And then we'll also have some time at the very end just to do kind of general wrap-up questions. So let's get started. As you can see, and as I've kind of mentioned, this is Textile Preservation 101. So this is the basics. The other thing I did want to mention though, because I saw a few people who were signed up who don't have an organization listed. So figuring that you might be private collectors or people with just, I mean, who doesn't have great grandma's quilt and wedding dresses and things here and there that they just maybe want to preserve in their home situations. So this presentation is going to be geared towards museums with the idea that we are preserving these things because they are historical items of the past that we want to continue to preserve for the future. However, if you do have questions that are a little bit more on the, I have an individual quilt at my own house, what are some things I can do? Feel free to ask those questions, and we will get to as many of them as we can because this presentation has actually also been done to that audience. So there are plenty of things we can talk about. All right, so it helps, there we go. It helps if I push the right button to advance the slides. So these are our quick objectives for the next 45 minutes, hour or so. I'm hoping that by the end of this, you will understand the different types of care that we have for textiles. Also, really briefly, I want to say that when I say textiles, I'm using it as the short way of saying textiles and costumes. So not only are we talking about flat textiles here like quilts and coverlets and tablecloths, but also things primarily made out of textiles. So costumes, wedding dresses, suits, the things of everyday life that are made out of textiles. So keep that in mind. I'm just going to use textiles because it's way more succinct. We also hope that by the end of this, you have learned some of the environmental best practices dealing with textiles, that you can identify the different types of deterioration, you can assess the condition issues of textiles, and that you're able to use all of those things to evaluate the storage and conservation needs of the items you're trying to preserve. So you are going to receive in the follow-up a PDF that will include a bunch of terminology. Easily could have spent an hour alone on learning the different terminology that comes up when we're talking about textiles. But instead I wanted to just include it as one of the PDF follow-ups. So if you're not familiar with sewing and textiles and things of that nature, you can go to that for some of the basic terms. So that'll get sent along to you. But these were kind of the three terms that I really wanted to make sure that we hit on and that we made sure that we understood the differences between them because they are very easy to confuse, and I honestly confused them until I went to graduate school and studied them much more extensively. So a lot of times when we talk about objects in museum collections, whether textiles or furniture or glassware or anything of that nature, you usually hear three different terms thrown around: preservation, conservation, and restoration. And each of these three are very different. Preservation is what we're going to focus on mainly today. Preservation is, like you see in the picture, it is purely the proper storage and handling of an item so that the item's condition doesn't change just by being in your care. So it doesn't get better, but it doesn't get worse either. So that's kind of the general basic of preservation. And then we're going to talk a lot more about how to do that in the next couple slides. Conservation, on the other hand, whose image you'll see here in the middle, is actually trying to stabilize condition issues that are happening in an item. So for instance, if you look at this photo, this is a textile that had, for whatever reason, there were holes in it, whether it be bug damage or poor storage or whatever the cause was. And instead of just leaving it and putting it in a box and properly storing it, which would have been preservation, they sent it off to have conservation done. And so you can see that there's another fabric behind that printed fabric that has been stitched, where the printed fabric that's tearing has been stitched down onto it. So what is happening is they haven't tried to mask the fact that there's damage there. What they're doing in conservation is simply stabilizing it so the damage never gets worse. So that's kind of the rule of thumb for conservation, is you're not trying to make it look pristine again. You're just trying to make it look a little bit better by stabilizing what's happening to it and making sure it doesn't happen further. On the last bit, you'll see restoration. Restoration is something that museums rarely undertake. It does happen. It happens actually a lot more in art museums with artworks than it does with history museums a lot of times. In part because with history museums, a lot of times we see damage as part of the story of the piece, whereas in art museum settings, often we're trying to represent the best possible side of the history of the piece, or show it in the light that it was originally made. So restoration, in short, though, is taking something that is damaged, like the rug that's shown here, and masking the fact that it had missing pieces. So they have reknotted this rug in the bottom picture to completely fill in the missing information. One of the things about restoration, though, is that if done properly and done by a reputable restorer, restoration doesn't happen through guesswork. It happens through fact. So there has been, like before they would have done the filling in of this spot on the rug, they would have done a lot of research into the rug, looking at the design of the rug throughout, trying to figure out what the repeat would be, what that part should have looked like, and then matching it as close to the original as possible. A lot of times in textiles with restoration, if it's possible, you try to follow the same stitch lines. If you're working on, let's say, replacing a waistband of a costume so it can be shown in an exhibit, you would try to even use the same pin pricks. So restoration is, if done well, is a really good thing to do with collections, but it's not the go-to for history museums, because we want to see the full history and story of the items. So those are kind of those three different words. Again, as I said, we're going to talk mostly about preservation. There's a slide or two at the end about conservation, but for the most part, this is all you're going to hear me say about restoration. So one of the first parts of preservation, one of the first parts of the puzzle, is to make sure that the environment that the textiles are living in is the best environment you can offer it. So when we look at collections in general, there are parts of our collection, we can kind of group them by materials in some ways as far as their preservation needs. So for instance, textiles fall into a grouping of things with photographs and prints and archives that are very light sensitive. So the more light that is on them for longer amounts of time, they can fade. And fading is something that you can't do, you can't reverse it. If it's faded, it's faded. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of these things that these issues will cause here in a little bit. But textiles fall into a group of things that have some really specific needs as far as making sure that they're preserved for the future as best as they can when it comes to their environment. So when it comes to light for textiles, we're talking here about light intensity. So really bright light versus really dim light. We want to keep that light intensity on textiles, especially when they're in exhibition spaces. Really with light when it comes to storage areas, just keep the light off if you're not working in them, and that'll pretty much cover your problems. But we want to keep the light intensity near something called 50 lux. And lux is just a way of measuring light. It is lumens per square meter. It's the primary way of measuring light that they use in Europe, which is why it's square meter. But it is also something that if you were to purchase a light monitor or a light reader from a museum site of some kind, lux would be one of the possible units of measurement. Here in the United States, we often talk about foot candles. Why they're called foot candles, I'm not sure, but that's what we call them. So you want to keep your light intensity around 4.5 foot candles. And if you're looking for a conversion, it's about 1 foot candle to 11 lux. When you're thinking about this, I don't remember the number right off the top of my head, but sunlight is like over 6,000 lux. So sunlight is very bright, and that is certainly not where we want to keep things. The other big thing about light when it comes to textiles is you want to eliminate ultraviolet light. So the light that comes from primarily from sunlight or from fluorescent lights. The UV rays in light are part of what makes light hot. So if you have a room, for instance, in our kitchen, we have a bunch of little halogen spotlights. And when we first moved in, they were all traditional halogen fluorescent lights. And it was 1,000,000 degrees in there. And so the first thing we did on the first day we moved into our house was go to the store and buy LED lights because they put off just as much light brightness, but without the heat and without the UV. And now it is an acceptable temperature in the kitchen. So you want to think about that because that light can up the temperature, and temperature is another big issue. So you want to protect your items from UV light. And when it comes to temperature, so we'll move on to that one, you want to keep the temperature for textiles between about 64 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And the other important piece of that puzzle is that you want to try to keep fluctuations of that by plus or minus 5 degrees. So let's say you have a historic museum and you have the temperature set at 70 degrees. And you think, okay, well, it's summertime, so we're gonna turn the air conditioner off when we all leave at night because we don't need to run it. It's not, we don't have people in there to keep comfortable. But if by turning it off, if the temperature suddenly spikes to 85, 90 degrees every evening before you leave, and then when you come back in, you're returning on that air conditioner and having it come back down to 70 degrees, you're causing issues in a variety of ways for your textiles. So one of those ways is because you have let that temperature raise above 75 degrees. The issue with that is that temperature is significant when it comes to the speed of deterioration, which is another reason why hot lights are a problem, because as heat rises, the molecules that make up everything, whether it be a synthetic fiber or a, cotton or whatever it is, those chemicals and the chemical reactions of things speed up when it's hotter. And so therefore the deterioration also speeds up. So something won't physically last as long in as good of condition at 90 degrees as it would at 65 degrees. The other issue with that is that as the temperature fluctuates, your items will have some reaction to that when it comes to textiles and costume items. So kind of having something that's really hot and then shocking it into really cold and then switching it is going to be much more detrimental than kind of slowly letting the temperature shift. One of the things that you sometimes will hear people talk about with temperature is that if you have, like, let's say you have a historic house museum and you have historic textiles in it, it's better to let that temperature change slowly. Frequently, historic house museums don't always have the HVAC infrastructure that they want. So it's better to kind of take a month to go from 64 degrees up to 85 degrees, if that's what it's going to be over the summer, rather than letting it happen overnight. So making sure that when you do have to change the temperature, that you do it slowly, and that you kind of keep it in that happy zone as much as possible. The last piece to this puzzle, especially with temperature, is relative humidity. So relative humidity is the percentage of water vapor the air is holding compared to the amount of water it can hold, which means that relative humidity is relative to the air temperature. So the higher the air temperature, the more moisture that the air can hold. So if the air is warmer, it can hold more moisture. If the air is colder, it can hold less. And the reason I say that is because your relative humidity, and the happy place for that is between 30 and 50%, with daily fluctuations of about 3% and seasonal fluctuations of about 10%. So that 10% is taking into account that in the summer months, 50% humidity is going to look a little bit different than, or is going to be a little bit different kind of moisture than 50% humidity in the middle of winter. So one of the things that I want to point out with that is if you have humidity issues in your storage area where you're storing your textiles, as the humidity fluctuates, your textiles, they are, I'm going to get this, I can't remember which one of the words that it is, but I think they're hydrophonic. And so they take in water. They like water. If water is available and moisture is available to them, they will take it in and then they will release it back out into the air as the temperature changes and more of the moisture can go into the air. And so they kind of have that give and take with water. And so if you have something like a wool fiber, every time it takes in water, it puffs up. And then every time it lets out water, it shrinks back down. And if it is constantly doing that every moment of every day, and it's doing that at a very high fluctuation, you can actually get the fibers that start to break. So your textiles can become more brittle because they've been doing this back and forth all day long, all year long. So that's why we want to kind of try to keep fluctuations to a minimum. Also, the other thing, if you remember nothing else about relative humidity, remember that 65% relative humidity and higher is very bad. 65% relative humidity and higher is what encourages mold growth. So if you keep things below that, even if you have mold spores that have made their way into your collection, they won't be active at a relative humidity less than 65%, whereas 65 or higher, they can become active and give you a bigger problem than you ever wished to worry about. So keep it below that 65. All right, really quickly, we're going to talk about the types of deterioration. So what we just talked about are kind of the best practices. And if you're following all of those to a T, which we all strive to do, but we can only do our best. If you follow all of those to a T, none of the things on this slide will happen. But it's good to know about them. So these types of deterioration are all environmental deterioration. So these are things that we can 100% prevent. Environmental deterioration is things caused by temperature issues, humidity issues, light, mold, and pests. So we didn't talk about pests with the environment stuff, but basically the best practice for pests is don't have them. do what you can to keep them out of your collection. So just to kind of explain some of these pictures that you're seeing, because they're great illustrations of all of these issues that can happen. Up in the center, you'll see what used to be a bright pink jacket. So that is a great representation of what light damage can do. So that fading that has happened because of most likely sunlight or high UV light, that fading can never be reversed. You can maybe send it to a conservator and have them try to over dye it, but that isn't usually going to be highly recommended by the conservator. So the best you can do is do like they did here in the picture, open the collar and say, hey, this is what it used to look like. So that's something that is entirely preventable if you keep your light levels low. The temperature and humidity issues, down on the bottom, you'll see that embroidery has kind of that blue has bled out into the white background, and that's caused by water damage, which can be caused by high humidity levels. So if there's a lot of moisture in the air that settles onto the fabrics, or if you try to wash something that you maybe shouldn't wash, which we'll talk a little bit about later, that can happen. And so that is because the blue dye has bled into the fabric and there's no way to get it out. So it's kind of another one of those, it's not reversible, but it's entirely preventable. On the lower right, you'll see the bottom of a 19-teens wedding dress that has been nibbled away by mice who thought it made a lovely home. Again, that is something that we can't undo, but we can fully prevent it. Or at least do our very best to make sure that those pests don't find their way into our museum collections for long enough to do damage. And then finally, up on the top, you'll see evidence of mold on the sack up there. And that is, again, mold is a tricky subject because it is difficult to kill, but it is fairly easy to make dormant. So make it inactive. And when you make it inactive, it is basically keeping it at the proper temperature and relative humidity so that it doesn't grow again. And also kind of isolating it from other things so that if something happens and it does begin to grow again, that it doesn't hop to other objects. So these are all environmental issues that if they're happening, you should take a look at your kind of what you're doing as far as preservation, as far as storage, what your environmentals look like in your museum, and see where you can correct the problem and kind of keep it from happening further. The flip side of environmental deterioration. Oh, Tamara, was there a question?
We did. We had a pest question
Yes.
about discouraging pests, specifically silverfish.
Oh, silverfish aren't really something that tackle textiles at all. Tamara, I know you've done a little bit more looking into silverfish with the archives work that you've done. Is there a preventative thing, or is it just keeping an eye out?
So with silverfish, it is when you bring anything into your collection, make sure you isolate it first from everything else. Make sure that it doesn't have silverfish when you're bringing it in, because silverfish will ride in on paper. They like kind of the glue and the things that are in paper. So one of the best things to do to prevent silverfish is to stop them from coming in, kind of like all pests. So that's sort of one of the things with silverfish. The other thing about silverfish is that they're one of those pests that is harder to kill without damaging the object they're infesting. So one of the ways that you can do that is isolate. If you know what has silverfish, and those are those little, they look kind of like the gray roly-polies, and they almost look like they have antennae at both ends. Google them, you'll recognize them. There's something else called fire brats. They look like light red silverfish. So one of the best things to do is to isolate that object. You can put it in some sort of tub with a lid, and then you can line the perimeter of that tub on the inside, not the object itself, with borax. And as the silverfish cross that borax, it sort of, the crystals in the borax are small enough that it slices the silverfish up. But Eric, if you're interested in knowing more, feel free to email me, and I will go ahead in the chat and pop up my email address, and I can let you know more about silverfish. Yes, if the fabrics were stashed in cardboard boxes, that could happen, because silverfish and fire brats like paper. So absolutely, Eric. If you have things stored in cardboard boxes and the silverfish get to those boxes, you may take the textile out and see the silverfish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the best things that you can do to kind of help prevent pests in your collection is whenever new items come in, whether they're textiles or anything else, is to do a thorough investigation of them. So if you get something in and let's say it's 4 o'clock on a Friday and you're not going to be able to do an inspection of it until, you know, Monday morning, don't take that box into your collection storage, plop it down and leave it there for the weekend. Instead, have a couple of large Sterilite tubs, clear Sterilite tubs on hand that you can put the objects in, close the tub, and kind of do a check on them. That way, if there's anything that came riding in on it that you haven't discovered yet, hopefully it will at least contain it until you can get it back out on Monday morning and kind of take a look at it. One of the issues with textiles is that there are often, especially with costumes, there are often lots of cracks and crevices that things can hitch a ride in. So yeah, you want to make sure that you're not bringing anything into your collection that is unwanted. If you don't have the ability to have Sterilite tubs or anything like that, see if you have a space where it's a pretty decent ceiling room, so not something with like a 2-foot or a 2-inch crack at the bottom of the door. But even if it's just a small office or a small closet that you can really seal up as well as you can, so that you can put items in there in order to kind of wait until you can really take, you know, everything out and unfold it and check it out and make sure that it is free of pests before you bring it further into the collection. All right, so the other type of deterioration that we often see is something called inherent vice. So inherent vice is the kind of deterioration that we can't do anything about. So no amount of proper storage and proper environmental conditions is going to prevent these things from happening. It may slow them down ever so slightly because some of them are chemical reactions. So if the heat is too high, if the temperature is too high, we might speed them up, but they're going to happen whether they're being kept in the tundra or if they're being kept in the Sahara. It's gonna happen. So the primary types of inherent vice are things like chemical fading of textiles. So early dyes that were used on fabrics are not very stable at all. It took them quite a while to come up with stable dyes. So sometimes you'll see something that looks like it has light fading, only it's been being stored in a box and there doesn't really seem to be any rhyme or reason to the fading. A lot of times that is a chemical fade that has happened. It's because, you know, they used yellow and blue dye to make a green, but the yellow dye is chemically reacting and fading, and so now it's turning more blue. You see it a lot actually with purple garments. You'll see things that are turning more blue or pink instead of staying their true purple. So that's something that can happen with early synthetic dyes. Another issue is iron mordants. So with natural dyeing, you would use iron as one way to help affix a colorant or a dye to fibers. So the picture at the top where you see that hole in the middle of the sampler, ignore the hole. That's actually not what we're talking about. That's bug issues. That's a pest issue. But if you look at the numbers on the sampler, those ones in dark brown, it seems as though there are bits and pieces of them missing. And that is because the iron mordant that was applied to the yarn before it was dyed with probably a very acidic walnut is eating away at the fiber itself and actually just disintegrating the fiber. So iron mordants are an issue we see a lot with like 18th century and early 19th century items, especially anything that was dyed brown or black. So that's why you'll see just little weird, you know, number 7 shaped holes in something, or it looks like someone just forgot half the alphabet in their sampler. And that's because those iron mordants are attacking the very thing they were used on. Another issue is weighted silk. So weighted silk is natural silk that has been cleaned, and then at the turn of the century, it was weighted with different chemical compounds. And this gave it kind of a nice texture and sheen and rustling sound, and was used a lot for cheap linings, so for dress linings. Down at the bottom, you'll see a picture of what weighted silk looks like. It basically looks like you let your cat loose into the box of textile and they tried to scale up the inside of the garment. Weighted silk often just flakes away as you move the garment around. Any breathing too heavy around it makes it flake. So that is something that it can be good to be able to identify, because it's good to know that it's nothing you're doing. Sometimes with weighted silk objects, you can kind of take a look at them. Sometimes conservators will take a look and they will just suggest removing the entire lining of the item if the lining does not provide any kind of structure to the garment that would be missing if it wasn't there. Other times they'll suggest removing the lining and rebuilding the lining. But if you have, let's say, a wool winter coat that has a shattering silk lining, we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about identifying conservation issues or condition issues, and you may find that this coat, there's no reason why it can't go on display. It can certainly go on a mannequin. The coat itself is very strong and able to be displayed. It's just that the silk lining inside of it is going to shed and shatter as you put it on the mannequin. Well, you might determine that you're okay with that because this weighted silk, there's nothing you can do about it. It's just going to continue to degrade. So continue to use the object and just sweep up the little shards after you put the coat on the mannequin and call it a day. The last bit of inherent vice that we often see is synthetic fiber disintegration. So down at the bottom, you'll see a little bit of white tulle. That was a wedding veil from the 1960s. And it has just split because as synthetic fibers are being created throughout the early and mid 20th century, they weren't perfect the first time around. Early polyester was not perfect. Early nylon was not perfect. So it often had chemical issues that would cause it to break down faster and break those chemical bonds that are holding it together. Again, this is something that keeping things at a slightly lower temperature or at a constant temperature can extend their life because it slows down the chemical molecules when they're at a colder temperature, but it doesn't make them stop completely. So you will still get that kind of disintegration happening regardless of what you're doing preservation-wise. All right, so now that we kind of know about the kind of deterioration that we can prevent versus the kind that we just kind of have to do our best to work around, let's talk about storage methods. So the way you store and handle textiles is one of the best preventative methods that we have. So even if you have awful environmental conditions, mishandling, or rather, even if you have amazing environmental conditions, mishandling an item can still tear it and snag it and cause issues. But the reverse is also possible. You can create small areas in your museum through proper storage that even if your environmentals aren't perfect, the storage will help at least push back against some of those deteriorating factors. So when it comes to storage methods for textiles and costumes, there are 4 main ways that we store them: either hanging, boxed, rolled, or in drawers. Usually drawers are used for things that are too big to fold or things that we don't want to fold. So we're going to talk about each one of these specifically. So if you choose to do hanging storage, hanging storage is something that museums will sometimes choose because maybe they have more space for hanging racks than they do for shelving. Hanging storage can also be a heck of a lot cheaper because you don't have to buy acid-free boxes for everything and acid-free tissue paper. You just need some padded hangers. And then some dust covers that you can make out of unbleached cotton muslin. So when it comes to hanging garments, there are a couple of things to note. First, you always want to use padded hangers. No wire hangers. Please remove all wire hangers from your collection tomorrow. The reason for this is that metal hangers are not high quality, and one of the things that will often happen is as the metal degrades and the costume degrades, they will actually fuse together. If you have ever found something hanging in the back of a historic home or a history museum that has had horrible temperature fluctuation and humidity issues, and something's hanging on a wire hanger, it's not uncommon that when you remove that wire hanger, you will remove chunks of the costume that was on it. So they're a bad idea. So remove them if at all possible. Another thing that happens is that with all clothing, if you kind of think about just the way that we wear clothes, our clothes are made so that our entire shoulder holds up the sweater we're wearing. It's not a 1/4 inch piece that just lays on like 3 or 4 rows of yarn or thread. It is a 4-inch part of the material that it's meant to be holding up that item. So we want to try to replicate that as much as we can with padded hangers. So you want to do padded hangers. One of the things that I'm going to send you in the follow-up email is a link to a site that shows you how to make padded hangers. So I'm not going to go into that. But you want to pad them out. Usually the standard is about 2 inches, and that gives a broad shoulder to the piece that you're hanging. It gives a little bit more, well, a lot more support if we're talking about metal hangers as another option. It gives the item more support, and it just kind of offers a much better situation. The other nice thing about padded hangers is that you can pad them out more or less depending. So let's say you've got a men's wool military uniform that's really heavy and has really wide shoulders. You could pad the hanger out a bit more to give it even more strength. So you want to support things from the shoulder. So if you have any item that has horrible shoulders, if there's deterioration there, don't hang it, box it instead. And we'll talk about that in a second. You want to use muslin waistbands, if at all possible, to support skirts. So a lot of times in our own homes, if you're a woman who wears skirts or a gentleman who wears skirts, you know that you want to clip that, you just clip that waistband into the hanger, no big deal. But sometimes when you unclip it, you'll notice like the lines that have happened in there, or that the waistband has kind of stretched out a little bit because you're asking these 2 little spots to hold up the entire skirt. So instead what we can do is we can attach a muslin waistband to it, which allows us to distribute that weight of the item across the entire garment. So that's something that you can do. You can use support straps to hold up heavy garments. You also might, in the picture above, you see a dress that has another hanger that has a piece that's supporting the train. And in part, that is just because you don't want that train hanging on the ground. So we want to try to support it and keep it off the ground if the hanging rack isn't quite high enough to do that itself. So hanging can be, like I said, it can be a really good option if your costumes are in good condition, and if you have, if your funds are such that having a bunch of hangers and a hanging system makes more sense than anything else. If you can though, boxing or putting textile items in drawers is the best option, but it takes a lot more pieces. It takes a lot more supplies. So anytime you're storing textiles, you want to use acid-free and lignin-free materials only. This is for a couple of reasons. One of those reasons is when it comes to textiles, they are very easily stained, as we all who wear textiles know. So one of the things that stains them, and stains them in a way that even a conservator cannot get out, is the natural acids that occur in wood. So for instance, cardboard boxes that are made out of wood pulp have acid in them. As that cardboard box deteriorates, that acid leaches out and attaches to the next closest thing. If that next closest thing is grandma's wedding dress, then you'll get these little white or these little brown spots all over where that item was touching the cardboard. And in doing that, it will stain. It is a chemical stain. It changes the chemical composition of the item there where it has stained. So there is no amount of bleach or anything that would ever get it out. So the only thing to do about it is to prevent it. So we prevent it by using acid-free boxes and acid-free tissue paper. The other term that you heard me use was lignin-free. That is something because lignin is another chemical compound in wood pulp. And what happens is something can be acid-free today because they've removed all the acid from the item. But if there's still lignin in it, that lignin will become acidic over time. So in order to buy an acid-free box that will remain acid-free, it has to be acid and lignin-free. So you'll see here that we kind of want to put, you don't want any heavy creases in things that you're boxing because their own weight will push them down. So you can use kind of tissue paper logs in the folds. And again, this is acid-free tissue paper. You can kind of crumple them up and use them where any major fold is happening in the quilt or in the garment that you're packing. If you're putting multiple items in a box, make sure that the heaviest items are on the bottom. You'd rather have a 1920s silk dress sitting on top of a 19-teens wool coat rather than the other way around. So just kind of think logically when it comes to that. And also we want to be careful not to overfill boxes, because if you put 7 things in a box and then have to have 4 people sit on it in order to get the box to close, then that's not a very effective preservation means. So we want to make sure to not overfill boxes. I also wanted to mention, if you're storing things in drawers, it's very similar. If you need to wrap things, use acid-free tissue paper. If you have to, like maybe you're trying to put quilts or let's say a silk flag in a drawer and it needs folded once or twice, use the tissue logs. Basically, it's same concepts. It's just the box is a different form and it's in the form of a drawer. So similar ideas. The last way that we're going to talk about is rolled storage. So rolling storage can be really great for anything that you don't want to risk creasing. So for instance, if you don't have drawers, let's say you have a large silk flag. Silk is notorious for breaking along any fold lines because it's just a delicate fiber. So you might, if you can, you might want to put that flag in a drawer that can hold flat, where it doesn't need any folds. But if you can't, you might consider some rolled storage. So you can purchase acid-free and lignin-free materials. So these aren't just cardboard tubes, they're acid-free cardboard tubes. But what you would do is you would lay down some tissue paper on top of that flag, and then you could slowly roll it up. This also works for the exact opposite. So something that's really heavy, like a carpet, you can also roll this way, or a large quilt you could roll. The thing to remember about rolling items is that once you roll them, you want to suspend them. No rolling something and then storing it on end in a corner somewhere like we do with our wrapping paper. Because what will happen is exactly what happens with our wrapping paper sometimes. You bring it out at Christmas and there's like this 2 inches at the bottom that's gotten all crunchy. The same thing will happen. Those things will slide and then they'll put a lot of pressure on this one strip on the bottom. So instead what you want to do is either like up in the upper right hand corner where there's an entire wall of just metal rods that hook in that you can slide those tubes onto. The other option is down at the bottom. They have that same kind of system, only it's in drawers. So those items are suspended. There's a little bit of space between the bottom of the roll and the shelf itself. Nothing is sitting on them. So that is something that you want to think about, is if you're going to do rolled storage, you need a way to somehow suspend it. So another thing, we're just going to run through this list pretty quickly. It's pretty general, but this is Textiles 101, so we're going to talk about it here. Safe handling of textiles. If you've stored them correctly, if you have the best environmentals, and then you treat them like you would treat the quilt that you throw on your bed and sleep under for 3 weeks and then throw in the washing machine, it's not going to matter how well you took care of it. So here are some things that we want to keep in mind. And I also do want to do a small disclaimer here that this does not take into account any additional precautions you might want to take during coronavirus. So for instance, this first one where we talk about safe handling, usually with textiles, we say washed hands are better than gloves for a lot of situations. When it comes to textiles, there are certainly other collection items that you have to wear gloves for. But when it comes to textiles, washing your hands is often better. And that is because textiles so easily tear, and it can be really important to be able to feel the strength of the fabric that you're handling. And so knowing whether this is something that's really delicate, that's going to start to flake away if you pick it up too hard or move it too much, or is it something that's really strong and sturdy? There are some times when you might consider wearing gloves with textiles. When we talk about gloves, I am talking about nitrile gloves, which fit like a latex glove, but they're not made out of latex. So if you have a latex allergy, it's not a problem. They're nitrile gloves, medical grade, can get them at Walgreens under the first aid section. But nitrile gloves are impermeable. So what it does is actually when you're talking about using nitrile gloves with textiles, it's more because you're trying to protect yourself from the textile. So for instance, if you just got a new donation of textiles and you don't know where they've been, you don't know if that stain that's on it is because someone, in 1920 spilled a glass of white wine, or if it's because some mouse 3 weeks ago used it as a restroom, you might want to wear gloves because it's not about protecting the object at that point, it's about protecting you. So there are times when you might want to wear gloves to protect yourself. But as I said, general rule of thumb when it comes to everyday handling of textiles in your collection that are safe is washed hands over gloves. Another piece to that puzzle is excuse me, supporting a garment at all times, especially at stress points. So stress points are any seam of the garment, the waistband of a dress, or the spot where the arm is attached to the rest of the men's coat. Those are all stress points because those are already points that are specifically, that are inherently less strong than other parts of the garment. So you'll want to be knowledgeable about where the stress points might be and really support things at that point. If you have hanging storage and you're moving hanging garments, hold them by the hanger hook. Don't grab the side of the hanger like so many of us do when we're in our own closets. I know I do it all the time. I just grab the sleeve of the dress and push it over. Always move it by the hanger because nothing about that other way is going to make for a good preserved garment. Also, you want to make sure to remove any of your own jewelry or fasten any closures that you're wearing that might snag something. So if you like big, long necklaces, that's super awesome. But maybe if you're bending over looking at a delicate silk flag, you might want to take the necklace off or tuck it into your shirt. Or one of the things that I do frequently is, depending on how I am looking at a textile, I actually will take my engagement ring because, like everybody, so it's got a stone that pops up, and I'll actually just turn it around and I'll stick it to the inside of my hand so that I'm not as likely to catch it on something depending on what I'm doing, because there are times when the bottom of my hand is what's dealing with the textile, or there are actually times when it's the top of my hand when you're dressing mannequins. But just being aware of having, you know, a watch band that could snag or a bracelet that could snag when you're working with textiles. You always want to place garments on clean, flat surfaces. Lay down a clean sheet if you're unsure, if you don't know when the last time was that the table was wiped clean, or if you're disinfecting the area because of coronavirus, you know, that's great. But you don't want to risk that any of those chemicals lingering from that disinfectant will get on the historic garments. So keep a couple of old, very clean sheets around and throw a sheet over the table before you put the garment down, and that will help protect the garment. And then last but not least, and I think usually it goes without saying when it comes to collections, but no food, drink, or pens around textiles. They stain, they're hard to get out. Really quickly, I wanted to run through a quick condition assessment. So we're not going to talk super in depth about this, but I wanted to point out the two different types of condition issues that most items in general have, and textiles specifically. So the two different types of condition issues tend to be either structural condition issues or cosmetic condition issues. Structural condition issues are things that have weakened the textile overall. So they're things like tears that are near any of those stress points that we talked about, so any seams, large holes or large tears near those stress points or just in general on the garment. Obviously, a hole that is 3 inches by 3 inches in the middle of the skirt is going to be a lot worse than a hole that is, you know, 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. So anything that's large. And another structural issue is brittle fibers. So things like we talked about the weighted silk, but that kind of disintegration can happen naturally with other kinds of textiles too, just not to the same extent. And it's usually environmentally caused. But brittle fibers are another thing that are structural. You know, you just have to be careful with it. Structural issues a lot of times are what will make a difference when you're choosing how to store something or whether or not something can be displayed. So those are the kind of times that you really want to be looking for structural issues. The other kind of condition issues that we have are cosmetic issues. So these are the things that don't look pretty, but aren't necessarily changing the way we act around the item. So things like discoloration. Like we talked about, whether it be light fading or chemical fading, it doesn't look great, but it's not hurting the integrity of the item in terms of any kind of discoloration isn't going to affect whether you hang something or store it boxed. But a big tear in the seam of a garment could make that difference. Stains are the same way. Stains are just discoloration caused by a different reason. So staining is another thing that it won't necessarily change how we treat the item, but it might change just our understanding of the item. And the other thing is small tears and holes. So you'll see obviously tears and holes in both sections, because like I said, if you have a tear in or a small hole in the middle of, let's say in the middle of a shirt front on a men's shirt front, if it's, you know, 1/4 of an inch by 1/4 of an inch, it's probably not causing any structural damage whatsoever. If it's right there in the center front of the shirt, it just doesn't look great. But if that same placement of a hole is a 3-inch hole, now you've got some conditioned structural issues because of its placement and its size. So that's something that you just kind of have to be careful of. All right, these are our last 2 slides, quick slides on preservation. There are a very few kinds of conservation, preservation things that you can do on your own. And those 2 really are vacuuming and steaming something. So these are considered preservation because they're not making any changes to the item. So when it comes to vacuuming a textile, I'm also going to send you a resources list, and that in there is going to have a link to a full description of kind of walkthrough of how you vacuum a textile. Obviously, it's not that we just put our Hoover on top of it and go to town, but vacuuming a textile can be great for helping to get off any bug casings or dust or anything like that. It can be especially useful when something first comes into your collection or when something's coming off of exhibit. So there are two main ways that you can vacuum off a textile. One is at the top. It's by taking a piece of window screening, cover the edges because you don't want any rough edges around the sides, and vacuuming up with a low suction hose attachment to your vacuum and sucking up things through there. The other issue is you can also use down at the bottom, there's a little bit more delicate of a piece or a piece that has maybe more crevices than a quilt does. So you can take a soft natural bristle brush and use it to kind of, basically what you're doing is you're flipping the dust and debris up into the air, and then the vacuum is sucking it out of the air instead of off the textile directly. And what you can do there is you can put a small piece of like pantyhose or something over the top of the vacuum. And the reason for that, and which is the same for the reason for the screen, is because you don't want to suck up any loose thread, that where a loose thread that you kind of pull suddenly becomes a really big tear. So that's what you're trying to do, is you're trying to prevent that from happening. So what you will have to do if you're covering the end of the vacuum is every once in a while, removing it from over the textile, turn the vacuum suction off and kind of brush off the top to get off any dust or debris that's maybe starting to clog it up. And then the last thing you can do is steaming a garment. So if you are getting ready to put it on display, a lot of those creases and things where we would naturally maybe think, oh, I'll put an iron to it. We don't want to put that kind of heat and pressure on, but what you can do is a slow injection of heated water through steam. So you can do that very carefully. One of the key rules of thumb when steaming a garment is you need to be able to put your hand on top of the garment. And if you're holding the steamer so close that you have to move your hand away because it's too hot for your hand, then it's too hot for the garment. So it is a slow process. So just kind of keep that in mind. It will take longer than if we're doing it at home and you just stick that steamer right up along and steam it that way, but it can make a big difference. So those are both things that you can pretty confidently do at home. These are two things that are best left to professionals. Repair and stabilization, conservation. So you can see there's a flag up top, and that flag has been repaired down at the bottom. Yeah, it makes a big difference. I wouldn't want to tackle this on my own without training. Even as a trained conservator, I don't want to tackle this. And then the other thing that you want to be careful of is wet cleaning. And part of the reason for this is wet cleaning, excuse me, I have the hiccups. Wet cleaning is just any type of cleaning of a garment that involves water. The reason you want to leave wet cleaning to the professionals is because there are very specific ratios of water and soap. There are also, you need to be really careful. One of the first things that a conservator will do before putting any item in any kind of water is they will sample every different color on that item. So that means making sure that nothing will run. So we saw earlier that white garment that had some blue embroidery on it. That blue embroidery, every color of embroidery would have been checked. And if any one of them was going to move around when put in water, the item wouldn't be wet cleaned. So you have to really be in attention to detail, in an attention to detail situation when doing any kind of wet cleaning, because just putting it in the washing machine is not going to be a good plan. So here are key takeaways, and then we're going to take some questions. So hopefully after this last 50 minutes, you have kind of understood that some deterioration is preventable, but some is also just merely slowed down. So understanding that there are things that you can do and other things that are just naturally going to occur. Also, the proper storage and handling is paramount to long-term preservation. Those are things that you have a lot of control over, full control over your handling most of the time, and at least as much control as possible over your storage. And that also knowing that you know the different types of condition issues, and that these can kind of help establish conservation priorities. So if they're just cosmetic issues, maybe it's something that doesn't rise up to the level of seeking out grant funding to find a conservator to pay them all that they are worth and more in order to conserve the item. But if it's a structural issue and it's a really important piece of your area's history, then it might be worth it. So kind of understanding what those different types of condition issues are is important. All right, so I've been seeing a lot of things popping up. that things are happening in the chat. So question.
Karen.
Yes.
Catherine has a question in the Q&A. She has two 1960 silk dresses from Japan. They're wrinkled but in good condition, and she wants to know if she can steam them before she boxes them.
So if you have items that are wrinkled, any place where there is a strong, hard wrinkle or crease is possible for a split to happen down the fibers. So if you wanted to steam those before boxing, you could certainly do that. What I would suggest is making sure that you're really steaming from far away. So do a slow steam. And again, if you put your hand up on the garment and it's too hot for your hand, then you're too close with the steamer. The biggest thing that I would say is if you're doing the steaming before boxing it, as opposed to steaming it before it's going to be on display, is to make sure that you give those items plenty of time to release any of that excess moisture before boxing them. So maybe steam them today and don't box them up for another week, just because you really want to make sure that you're not about to trap a bunch of extra moisture into the box. So that would be my first suggestion. Of course, you can do it. Really make sure they're dried out before you put them in a box. All right, was there anything else, Tamara, or mostly just chit-chatting over there?
Mostly just some chit-chat. I do want to let everybody know that if you're interested in all kinds of information about all kinds of collection stewardship, you can subscribe to our monthly e-newsletter, and Karen edits and writes a lot of the information for that. It's called Collections Advisor, and you can email Karen and let her know you'd like to subscribe. I know also that Karen is always looking for guest writers for Collections Advisor. So if you're interested in writing something, let Karen know. Collections Advisor has how-to tips and tricks, case studies, all kinds of things. Everything. And I know Karen would be interested in letting
and having someone else write them.
Talking to you about what you might be able to contribute. Yes.
Yes. Yeah, and we do have
Karen.
I was just going to mention that we do put them on the past collections advisors because we've got over 100 collections advisors that have been done. So past ones are made available in PDF form for free on our website. So if you go to indianahistory.org, you'll find us under the statewide services, and then under our resource page, we have collections advisor, and you'll be able to find everything that we've ever written about under there.
And I'd also like folks to know that Karen has authored a book that's available through Rowman and Littlefield. It is the Care and Display of Historic Clothing. And it's a very, very accessible guide to you caring for your clothing. So, you know, if you want to go more in depth and want to have that resource. Also for folks in Indiana, we have a lending resource library, and we can send you books from that lending resource library. We mail them to you, and you mail them back to us after keeping them for about a month. You know, just let us know. If you're outside of Indiana and are interested in our lending resource library and what we may have in there and why we have it, we'd also be willing. We'd also could talk to you about that. So just contact Karen if you're interested.
Yep. So it looks like we did have another kind of additional question come in, asking if steaming can activate mold spores. The answer is yes. So you do want to do some looking at the garment before you steam it to see if there's any evidence of mold. A lot of times, like a good majority of the times, there will be stains where the mold will leave black stains, brown stains, red stains, whatever color of stains it wants, depending on what kind of mold it is. So there's usually some kind of evidence that there is possible mold living in that garment. So do be mindful and maybe avoid steaming anything that you think might have mold in it. Contact a conservator first and find out a little bit more about killing off those mold spores and how you can possibly steam it more safely, and they might just advise you not to. So I would say a good rule of thumb is if you think that there's mold, don't steam it, because then you're heightening its relative humidity and its temperature. So all of those things that mold loves. But in theory, and I will say this having not studied mold extensively, theoretically though, once those things go back away, the mold spores should go dormant again. So if you are steaming something, you know, and you're activating mold spores, if you're doing it in an enclosed space where the mold spores then can't attach to anything else, and then that space and that item are able to go back down to a below 65% relative humidity and a lower temperature, then those mold spores should deactivate again. But yeah, if you can avoid it, just avoid it. Kind of determine whether or not it's worth the risk to have the wrinkles out. All right, was there anything else that anyone had a question about? Again, I will point out I've got my email address right there on the screen. We are working from home still, so my phone number is there. If you call it and leave a message, I will receive that message. You just won't get me directly, but you will get a call back. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, contact me, and I am happy to answer whatever I can. And you will get a follow-up email with the recording information, also with a link to an evaluation that we hope you'll take a little bit of time to fill out for us, because we often offer some version of our programs multiple times. And so we want to make sure that if we can do anything to improve, that we are aware of it and do it. And also you'll find some resources attached to that email as well. So thank you all so much for coming, and I wish you a good and healthy rest of your day.